The origins of Operation Gold lay not in arrogance, but in desperation. By the early 1950s, the Iron Curtain was more than a political metaphor. It was an intelligence brick wall. The Berlin blockade of '48 had shown the West just how quickly the Soviets could escalate a crisis. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, a clear proxy conflict, fueled a pervasive fear in Washington and London. Was this the prelude to World War III? Was the massive Soviet military force stationed in East Germany, 22 divisions, over 300,000 troops, poised to pour through the Fulda Gap and roll to the English Channel? The truth was, the West had no idea. Traditional human intelligence, spies on the ground, was incredibly difficult and dangerous. The KGB and the Stasi had created a surveillance state of terrifying efficiency. Technical intelligence, primarily listening to Soviet radio traffic, yielded mountains of low-level data, but most of it was heavily encrypted. The high-command conversations, the ones that could reveal a surprise attack, were not happening on the radio. As Colonel Morozov so confidently believed, they were happening on landlines. The idea to go after these landlines was not entirely new. The British Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, had pulled off a similar, smaller-scale operation in post-war Vienna, codenamed Operation Silver. They had successfully tapped Soviet cables running through the British sector of the occupied city and gleaned valuable intelligence. When the British brought the concept to the CIA's legendary director, Allen Dulles, he saw the potential for a masterstroke. Vienna was one thing, but Berlin was the main artery. Tapping the cables there would be like placing a stethoscope directly on the heart of the Soviet military machine in Europe. The risks were astronomical. Discovery was not just a possibility, it was a constant, looming threat. If caught, the propaganda fallout would be catastrophic. The United States would be exposed as violating Soviet sovereign territory, engaged in a brazen act of international espionage. It could even be the spark that ignited the very war they were trying to prevent. But for Dulles, the potential reward, a true unvarnished look into the Soviet order of battle, their intentions and their capabilities, was worth the gamble. The project was greenlit in absolute secrecy. The plan, conceived by the CIA's Berlin chief, William King Harvey, and MI6 was a marvel of subterranean engineering. The first challenge was location. They needed a spot in the American sector that was as close to the target cables as possible, but also provided a plausible cover for a major construction project. They found it in the district of Rudow, a sleepy corner of West Berlin, where the border was just a line on a map. The chosen target was a major cable junction on the Schönefelder Chaussee, a road just 5 feet inside the Soviet sector. Intelligence suggested this junction serviced the direct lines from Karlshorst to Moscow, as well as the lines connecting Red Army Command to airfields and divisions across the GDR. The cover story was the aforementioned U.S. Air Force radar station. This brilliant piece of misdirection explained away everything: the need for a deep foundation, the massive power requirements, the round-the-clock activity, and the endless convoys of trucks. It also explained the need for a large windowless warehouse, a building which would serve to hide the mountains of excavated earth. In September 1954, the digging began. A team from the U.S. Army, full of engineers, sworn to a level of secrecy that bordered on paranoia, was brought in. They started by sinking a vertical shaft, 6 meters or 20 feet deep, inside the shell of the warehouse. Then they began the horizontal push. The tunnel itself was a steel tube, 2 meters in diameter or 6.5 feet cramped, claustrophobic, and snaking its way under the death strip that separated the two worlds. The statistics behind the dig are staggering. The tunnel would eventually stretch for 450 meters, or 1,476 feet, nearly a third of a mile. To excavate it, the engineers had to remove over 3,100 tons of earth. That's roughly the weight of 50 main battle tanks. This soil couldn't just be dumped outside. It would be an immediate giveaway. Instead, it was meticulously packed into sandbags, hoisted up the main shaft, and secretly stored in the warehouse's expansive basement. Over 125 tons of steel liner plate and 20 tons of welding steel were used to shore up the structure, preventing a collapse that would have buried the crews and the operation forever. Progress was agonizingly slow, averaging just 10 to 15 feet per day. The work was done almost entirely by hand, using shovels and mining tools to avoid the noise of heavy machinery that might be picked up by Soviet seismic or acoustic sensors. The air was thick with dust, the temperature fluctuated wildly, and the constant fear of discovery hung over every shovelful of dirt. This was the silent, grueling front line of the Cold War, fought by men in hard hats, not helmets, deep beneath the earth. By February 1955, just as Colonel Morozov was smugly reviewing his security reports, the American and British diggers finally reached their destination. They were directly underneath the target cables. The unthinkable had been achieved. Now came the most delicate part of the entire operation, touching the Dragon without waking it. At the end of the 1,476-foot tunnel, a small, humid chamber had been excavated directly beneath the roadway. This was the nerve center, the tap room. Here, the brute force of engineering gave way to the delicate artistry of electronic espionage. The three main Soviet cables, each as thick as a man's forearm, were now exposed. Getting to them was one thing, listening to them was another challenge entirely. The Soviets were not amateurs. Their communications technicians ran regular, sophisticated tests on these lines, checking for any minute drop in electrical pressure or change in ambient temperature around the cables. A clumsy tap, a single severed wire, or even the heat from the listening equipment could trigger an alarm back at Karlshorst, bringing the entire operation crashing down. The CIA and MI6 needed surgical precision. For this, they turned to the British General Post Office, or GPO. In the 1950s, the GPO wasn't just for delivering mail, it was home to some of the world's leading telecommunications engineers. These were the men who had kept Britain connected during the Blitz, and their expertise was unparalleled. Flown into Berlin under the deepest cover, the GPO specialists got to work. The process was terrifyingly delicate. First, they built heavy clamps around a section of the cable to prevent it from sagging, which would have altered its tension and been detectable. Then, using what amounted to glorified can openers, they carefully cut a window into the thick, lead outer sheath. Inside, they found a baffling maze of hundreds of paper-wrapped copper wires. Each wire had to be identified, which ones carried the high-priority teletype traffic from KGB headquarters, which carried the voice conversations of Red Army generals. Working in the damp, cramped space, the engineers began the painstaking process of splicing. They would gently attach a microscopic electrode to a single wire, leading it back to a powerful custom-built amplifier. This allowed them to leach the signal from the wire without ever breaking the circuit. The signal was then fed into a massive bank of 30 Ampex tape recorders that lined the walls of the electronics room back down the tunnel. These machines, the pinnacle of audio technology at the time, ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In late May of 1955, the taps went live. For the first time, an American intelligence officer put on a pair of headphones, selected a channel, and was instantly transported inside the Soviet fortress. The effect was electrifying. Gone was the static, the coded gibberish of radio intercepts. This was crystal clear. It was the unfiltered voice of the enemy. The intelligence hall was beyond anything Allen Dulles had ever dreamed of. It was a fire hose of raw data. The CIA and MI6 were now privy to everything. They listened to KGB officers in East Berlin discussing operations with their masters in Moscow. They recorded the frantic scrambles of Soviet fighter squadrons during air defense exercises, revealing their response times, their radar capabilities, and their command and control weaknesses. They intercepted logistical reports detailing fuel and ammunition shortages in Red Army tank divisions, information that would be pure gold to NATO war planners. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Every day, A mountain of magnetic tapes was flown out of Berlin via a secure military air corridor to London and Washington, D.C. There, hundreds of translators and analysts, many of them Russian émigrés, worked around the clock in nondescript buildings. They transcribed, translated, and analyzed the torrent of information, building a mosaic of the Soviet war machine that was more detailed than any satellite photo or spy report could ever be. Over the 11 months and 11 days the tunnel was operational, they would fill over 50,000 reels of tape. They learned the identities of KGB agents operating in West Germany. They learned the complete Soviet and East German military order of battle. They even intercepted conversations that gave them a profound insight into the mindset of their adversaries, the petty squabbles, the bureaucratic infighting, the paranoia that riddled the Soviet system from top to bottom. For the first time, the monolithic, terrifying Soviet bear was revealed to be a complex, often dysfunctional, and deeply human organization. Operation Gold was not just an intelligence success, it was a psychological breakthrough. The West wasn't just reading the enemy's mail, they were living inside their head. But in the complex, mirror-filled world of Cold War espionage, no victory is ever that simple. As the CIA celebrated its unprecedented triumph, they were completely unaware of a fatal flaw, a poison pill that had been planted at the very heart of their audacious operation. His name was George Blake. Blake was a senior officer in MI6. He was charming, intelligent, and highly respected. He was also a committed communist and a mole for the KGB. And, crucially, he had been present at the very first meeting between the CIA and MI6, where the idea for the Berlin Tunnel was discussed. He knew about Operation Gold before the first shovelful of dirt was ever moved. He had personally delivered the entire plan, the blueprints, the location, the cover story, to his KGB handler. This raises the terrifying central question of the entire operation. If the Soviets knew about the tunnel from day one, why on earth did they let the Americans build it? The KGB's dilemma was excruciating. George Blake was arguably their most important asset inside British intelligence. He was a source of incalculable value, providing a steady stream of information on MI6 personnel, operations, and methods. To expose the tunnel immediately after he reported its existence would be to sign his death warrant. The trail would lead directly back to the handful of British officers privy to the initial planning meeting. Blake would be caught, interrogated, and imprisoned, and the KGB's window into the heart of MI6 would be slammed shut forever. So the masters of deception in Moscow's Lubyanka Center made a calculated, cynical, and strategically brilliant decision. Let them dig. This decision transformed Operation Gold from a simple act of Western espionage into a complex, multi-layered game of counterintelligence. The KGB was now in the bizarre position of monitoring the construction of a tunnel designed to spy on them, knowing every detail in advance. They chose to sacrifice the security of their tactical communications to protect their strategic human asset. It was a classic Cold War trade-off. The loss of some secrets was an acceptable price for keeping a priceless source in play. This also meant the Soviets had a degree of control over what the West was hearing. While it was impossible to reroute all traffic from the three massive cables, they could ensure that any truly vital state-level secrets, discussions of nuclear strategy, war plans, or the identities of their top agents, were never transmitted on those lines. The KGB effectively cordoned off the tapped cables, turning them into a high-tech echo chamber for the West. The intelligence the CIA and MI6 gathered was therefore genuine, but it was second-tier. The conversations about fuel shortages, the details of Air Force exercises, the KGB's internal gossip, all of this was real and immensely valuable for tactical analysis. It gave NATO a much clearer picture of the conventional Soviet threat. But the West never got the crown jewels. They were listening to the unfiltered conversations of the colonels, but not the Politburo. The Soviets let them have the battle plans, but kept the war plans for themselves. All the while, the KGB waited. They watched the West spend over $6.7 million, the equivalent of more than $75 million today, and expend enormous political and logistical capital on their grand project. They were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap, a moment when the discovery of the tunnel could be used for maximum propaganda effect while still appearing accidental enough to protect George Blake. That moment arrived on the night of April 21, 1956. The official Soviet narrative was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. Citing heavy rainfall that had supposedly caused a fault in one of the underground cables, a Soviet and East German Army repair crew was dispatched to the Schönefelder Chaussee. Just after midnight, under the glare of military spotlights, they began to dig. Inside the tunnel's listening post, the American and British technicians heard the rhythmic thudding of shovels hitting the earth above them. Then came the chilling sound of jackhammers. This was it. The prearranged alarm was triggered. The tappers had mere minutes. Following protocol, they began destroying sensitive equipment, grabbing what documents they could, and scrambling back down the 1,476-foot length of the tunnel towards the safety of the American sector. Behind them, a massive, sand-filled steel door was designed to slam shut, sealing the tunnel forever. When the Soviet soldiers finally broke through the concrete and steel, they found the abandoned tap room, the custom-built amplifiers, the clamps on the cables, the wires leading west. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. The next morning, the KGB played its trump card. They didn't just seal the tunnel, they turned it into a media circus. They invited journalists from all over the world, including the West, to tour the site. Soviet Major General Sergei Kondrashev led the press tour, dramatically pointing out the perfidious, gangster-like methods of the American spies. It was a propaganda coup of the highest order. Newsreels flashed images of the sophisticated tunnel around the globe, painting the United States not as a defender of freedom, but as a deceitful aggressor, brazenly violating international borders and sovereignty. For a brief moment, the CIA's greatest intelligence triumph became its most public humiliation. In Washington, the fallout was surprisingly contained. Allen Dulles, a master of bureaucratic survival, weathered the storm. While the press had a field day with the tunnel of spies, the operation was quietly spun as a calculated risk that had paid off handsomely. The official line was that the intelligence gathered, even if for only a year, was well worth the eventual embarrassment. For years, the CIA maintained that the tunnel had been a resounding, uncompromised success. The true, devastating nature of the compromise wouldn't come to light for another 5 years. In 1961, a Polish defector exposed George Blake, and the whole house of cards came tumbling down. Blake was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 42 years in prison, though he would later make a dramatic escape to Moscow. Only then did the CIA and MI6 understand the full, bitter truth. Their prize source had been a KGB-managed echo chamber from the very beginning. On the surface, it looked like a clear Soviet victory. They had protected their prize asset, controlled the flow of information, and scored a massive propaganda win. But in the long, grinding calculus of the Cold War, the discovery of the tunnel was a profound strategic defeat for the Soviet Union. The operation proved to the Kremlin in the most visceral way imaginable that there was no such thing as a safe space. Their faith in physical security, in the inviolable sanctity of their own territory, was shattered forever. The Americans and the British hadn't just listened in. They had tunneled under the Iron Curtain, set up shop in their basement, and stayed for almost a year. The sheer audacity, the engineering prowess, and the financial commitment it represented sent a shockwave of paranoia through the entire Soviet security apparatus. If the West could do this, what else could they do? Were there other tunnels? Were there new communication satellites being intercepted? Were their own officers immune to the lure of Western money? Operation Gold forced the KGB and the GRU into a defensive crouch from which they would never truly recover. They were compelled to pour billions of rubles they didn't have into countermeasures, into sweeping for bugs, into developing more complex and expensive encryption systems, and into a frantic internal mole-hunting purge that crippled their own effectiveness. The tunnel, even a compromised one, had planted a virus of suspicion deep inside the Soviet system. The final definitive admission of this psychological defeat comes not from a Western analyst, but from the very man who led the triumphant press conference in the captured tunnel, KGB Major General Sergei Kondrashev. Decades later, long after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he reflected on the operation. While he boasted of knowing about the tunnel in advance thanks to Blake, he conceded the deeper, more unsettling truth. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Looking back, the operation appears to have been a stunning success for Western intelligence. The very fact of its existence, its insolence and ingenuity, made a deep impression on us. We could only marvel at the technical skill and resources of our opponents." That was the true legacy of Operation Gold. It wasn't about the 50,000 reels of tape. It was about the insolence and ingenuity. It was a message delivered in steel and soil that American and British resolve could not be contained by walls or borders. It proved that in the shadow war for the future of Europe, the West's greatest weapon wasn't just its spies or its technology, but its boundless and sometimes reckless imagination. The KGB believed their communications were a fortress built on solid ground. They never imagined their enemy would simply disregard the ground itself, and prove that in the Cold War, the most audacious move is often the one that redefines the entire game.